was a pretty skilled cowboy, and he came west from Omaha and hooked up with John and Luella Church and started working for them. And they had a financial dispute. I believe John Church advanced Diamond Slim $1,300 to buy cattle for their operation. And Diamond Slim took the money and didn't buy cattle, they bought something else. We don't know. But they ended up having a dispute. And it appears beyond doubt that Diamond Slim shot John and Luella Church in their home, and then tried to act for a few days as if nothing happened. He apparently dragged their bodies out a couple miles away and buried them pretty well. But anyway, he occupied their home for a few days, and people started wondering, where are John and Luella? And Diamond Slim said, well, they sold the house and then they went south. I don't know where. And Diamond Slim made a couple of mistakes, despite including not having a decent explanation for why John and Luella Church abandoned their home and their place. And also, he aroused the suspicion of nearly everyone. So when he took a package to the post office to mail it off, he was being watched by the authorities. And they opened the package and found out that it had Luella's wedding ring, as well as another ring that John had given her after their marriage. And Diamond Slim was mailing it off to his sister in Omaha, and he got caught. So all of this stuff started to add up, and he was arrested after the aborted mailing thing, and incarcerated. And people started agitating for justice for Diamond Slim, and the authorities moved him around from Gillette to the jail in Custer to here in Newcastle, and maybe even Douglas along the way, I'm not sure. But anyway, he ended up in a jail in Newcastle. And by this time, the legal proceedings against him were moving forward. And there was an indication that he was going to plead either self-defense or insanity, or both. Self-defense didn't hold much water. That was a deal where apparently, according to Diamond Slim's story, Luella pulled a gun on him and he had no choice but to shoot him. And then John. But in any event, people around here started getting concerned that he might be able to use the insanity defense to get off. He had a couple of pretty good lawyers, and I don't know who they are, but they were agitating for the insanity defense, and people were starting to get worried. And as I said, they were moving Diamond Slim around, fearing that he might be the victim of a lynch mob. And he ended up in Newcastle in the spring of 1903, a couple of months after the murders of John and Luella Church. So a mob gathered outside the jail here in Newcastle, and they were clamoring, of course, for Diamond Slim to be released. An interesting thing that happened is Anna Miller, the wife of Sheriff Billy Miller, who was killed a year and a half later at Lightning Creek. Anna Miller spoke to the crowd through an open window of the jail, and I believe, if I remember right, I could be corrected, but I think she held them off for a couple of hours. They were doing the wrong thing, and they ought to let justice finally, someone in the mob said, well, that's enough, we've had it, let's do this. And they got a battering ram that they fashioned out of timber, and they were gonna knock down the door to the jail. And Billy Miller, the sheriff, said, no, don't do that. If you do that, you'll probably destroy the building. So always let him go. So they let him go, and he wanted to take, he was wearing some sort of slippers or soft shoes. He wanted to take his boots with him when they dragged him out of the jail. And somebody said, you're not gonna need boots from where you're going. So we went along with him, and they took him to a bridge, which is now gone. And tied a noose around his neck, pretty high up on his neck, and threw him over the bridge. And the rope was long enough so that it tore his head off. And you locals probably know all this story. But anyway, it tore his head off. The Undertaker put it on backwards. And he was displayed in the Undertaker's window for a couple of days, if not longer, before he was buried. And don't know where he was buried. Well, I guess we do know it was in Hawkins Cemetery here in Newcastle, but it's an unmarked grave, and we don't know. We do know that John and Luella Church their bodies were taken to Omaha and buried there. So that occurred in 1903. That is the most recent Black Hills vigilante lynching that at least I know of. And one of the most violent and most notorious. Let's see if the remote is working. I can't see the screen. No. That's Diamond Slim. I'm not sure when the photograph was taken, before or after he was arrested. And the next slide is, the bridge he was thrown off of. The bridge is now gone. I think it's the Cambria Bridge. It was pretty close to the jail, pretty close to downtown Newcastle. Yeah, that works, although I don't think it's moving the slides. Oh, it is. Okay. Now the next vigilante lynch.
Microphone.
The next vigilante lynching was in Rapid City, June 1877. 3 horse thieves, Doc Allen, Red Curry. I don't know if they had a green curry, but they
Turned it off.
I'm growing increasingly incompetent with electronics.
Dying on him. Oh, we can hear it now.
Thing?
Yeah, there you go.
All right, that sounds better than before. In June of 1877, 3 horse thieves, Doc Allen, Red Curry, and Kid Hall, were apprehended north of Rapid City after being pursued by railroad officials for horse thievery. And they were taken to the Rapid City Jail in 1877, which at that time was the American House Hotel, owned and operated by John Brennan, one of the founders of Rapid City. They didn't last long in the jail. They were dragged out and taken to what's called Hangman's Hill, Skyline Drive, out of Rapid City. Can't make the remote work. Where they were about to hang him, and Red Curry and Doc Allen kept saying, "Hey, Kid Hall, he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had nothing to do with it." And one of the lynch mob said, "Well, dead men tell no tales." So they strung him up from a tree on Hangman's Hill, Skyline Drive, and something went wrong. They didn't string the rope high enough, so the 3 men, you could see the tracks the next morning where they dragged their feet because they were strangled to death. They were not hanged, and that happened so often with vigilantes hanging. So Rapid City became known in the Black Hills area as Strangletown. Rather derogatory term, but somehow Rapid City survived it. The next lynching, vigilante lynching in the Black Hills, happened near Spearfish. There was a guy named George Keating who, anybody mind if I sit down?
The new store. This is the one-stop shop. We have a pharmacy. We have a bootlegger's liquor. The deli, the food that you can get at a lunchtime is so amazing. The coffee shop. Certain Friday mornings, there's 30 people sitting here in all these chairs. This is the hub for people to come and visit, have their coffee, have their donuts. It's amazing what this area has done. Totally amazing.
Anybody mind if I sit down? George Keating operated a butcher shop in Central City, and he went into partnership with a local rancher named Orbean Davis, and they wrestled cattle for several months until they got caught by local vigilantes. Now, the interesting thing about this lynching is we know who did it. It was a guy led by a guy named Uncle Johnny. Uncle Johnny Cashmere, who was a rather prominent businessman in Spearfish. Uncle Johnny went to the office of the Deadwood Pioneer Times in July of 1877 and said, and he basically confessed before they did it. He said, "There's been some lynchings going on here, and we know who did it, and we're going to take care of it." And so he and a couple of his buddies, one of whom we're pretty sure was a guy named Bill Hay, that I'll tell you about later, apprehended George Keating and his partner, Orvine Davis. Now that's Uncle Johnny Cashner at about that time, 1877. They apprehended George Keating and Orvine Davis, his partner, where they were camped at the bottom of Lookout Mountain near Spearfish, and hanged them there. Now, a couple of interesting things about the lynching of George Keating and Orvine Davis. One is we know who did it, because Uncle Johnny Cashner confessed to him. Uncle Johnny, as I said, was a prominent Spearfish entrepreneur and businessman. He owned a photography shop. He owned a furniture store, a mercantile store. His wife was a realtor, and she sold pianos. But apparently Uncle Johnny felt that law enforcement was inadequate, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. Yeah, I guess the next one. Yeah. Now that's Orvine Davis's tombstone at Rose Hill Cemetery in Spearfish. His family apparently had the wherewithal to erect a tombstone for him and have him buried at Rose Hill Cemetery. George Keating, on the other hand, I've never been able to find out where he was buried. Somewhere in Deadwood, and I believe the Catholic cemetery, but I believe that the cemetery, through subsidence over the decades and now into the century, has basically disappeared. But the interesting thing about George Keating, even though we don't know where he buried, his wife, who was reported in the Deadwood paper as being extremely distraught over his lynching, and she had an estate of George Keating probated. He had apparently, at least allegedly, loaned his mother $500, and that obligation from his mother to him became part of his estate. So it was probated in the court, territorial court in Deadwood, and his wife probated the estate. She was the executrix, and it basically consisted of the note that his mother owed him for $500, and then that note was primarily used to pay his funeral expenses. His widow had a rosewood casket made for him and hired a coach both for his body and for his close relatives to follow along for the funeral. And that, probably can't read it very well, but that is the settlement of his estate. He is the only lynching victim that I know of that had an estate that could be probated. Some more of his probate papers. Now, she was, as I said, very distraught, and a group of her friends decided to hold a benefit for her at the Central City Opera House, and it was advertised and highly touted, and it was going to be a major event to help her through her grief. But unfortunately, it was a financial disaster. And she had to run an ad in the Deadwood Pioneer Times saying, I didn't organize that benefit, it's not part of me, I have no obligation for any of this, and people who had donated money lost their money, and she went on. Now, interestingly enough, a few years later, she remarried, and the guy she married had been the bondsman for posting bond for her as executrix of her late husband's estate. And his name was Wes Snyder. And she and Wes Snyder had a couple of sons. One of whom tragically drowned in Whitewood Creek. But they lived quite on into the 1920s. Her name was Nellie Keating, and she, as I said, was married to Wes Snyder. Now, I always talk about that story because it is so interesting that there was a lynching victim who had a staged funeral and whose estate was probated and whose widow survived him and lived on in the Deadwood Central City area. So the next thing I talk about, I probably screwed that up too. The next thing I talk about is the Great Stoneville, Montana gunfight, February of 1884. Some of you may have heard about this already. It was Valentine's Day, 1884. A gang of horse thieves, well-organized gang of horse thieves, called the Axelby Gang, had made their living stealing horses in Canada and bringing them back down to this area and selling them. And they were notorious, and they were, law enforcement had been after them for some time. And law enforcement got word that the Axelby Gang was holed up in Stoneville, which is near Alzada, by the way, Stoneville, Montana, in a saloon there, waiting out a blizzard. It's Valentine's Day, it's almost 20 below, there's a blizzard going on. Weather is horrible. I've always said the gunfight at the Stoneville, Montana location would make a better movie than the OK Corral in Tucson because of the horrible weather and the shooting that went on. Now, a couple of people got shot at the Stoneville gunfight, not surprisingly. One of them was the sheriff, or perhaps the marshal at that time, a guy named John O'Hara out of Spearfish. He was killed in the fight. And here's his tombstone, which is interestingly enough at the Rose Hill Cemetery in Spearfish, probably not 150 feet from the grave of lynch victim Orbean Davis. And John O'Hara's tombstone, I don't know if you can read it on that screen or not, but it says, "Killed by horse thieves." And that's still there in Spearfish, his tombstone. Now, another guy that was shot during the Stonesville gunfight was a guy named Harry Tuttle. Harry Tuttle, like Kid Hall of the Rapid City lynching incident, was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Harry Tuttle was from a relatively wealthy family in Pennsylvania, but he was a horseman, and an expert horseman. And he had found his way out here to the west, looking for horses, and happened to fall into the Axelby Gang, with the Axelby Gang. Now, Harry Tuttle was, by all accounts, innocent, but innocent of any horse thievery. But he, of course, tried to escape the gunfight on a mule, and the mule became extremely excited by all the shooting and stuff, and bucked him off. And as he fell, he got a bullet in the elbow of his arm. Serious injury. And he was taken to what worked as a hospital in Spearfish. And that would be probably 50 miles from Stone Hill. So they got him into the hospital in Spearfish and put him in there, and he was in a great deal of pain. Was probably not expected to make it. But here we come with Uncle John Cashmere. Remember him? He's the guy that led the lynch mob that killed George Keating and Orbean Davis. Uncle John Cashmere and a couple other guys in buffalo robes broke into the hospital about 2 o'clock in the morning in late February. It's still really cold. And they dragged Harry Tuttle out. And put a rope around his neck and threw him over a cliff. And I learned from a Spearfish historian, Lindy Schuttler, of blessed memory, that this is the location where they threw him over the cliff.
In addition to the weekly printed version of the newsletter journal, we also promote our community and share important information on our award-winning website, newslj.com, and in our weekly email newsletter, Nuke Now. We also connect with readers through various social media platforms and invite you to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can even take a look at a recent meeting of the City Council, School Board, or County Commission on our YouTube channel. We do hope that you will go to newslj.com and subscribe today, and we look forward to making all of our great content available to you. But regardless of your level of support, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for doing your part to preserve a free and independent local press.
That this is the location where they threw him over the cliff. This is now a rather pristine part of Spearfish City Park. It's called Indian Springs. He, like other lynch victims, Harry Tuttle, he died from strangulation rather than having his neck broken in a proper hanging. I learned in one of my recent speeches that next one, not on the slide. Anyway, there is now a tombstone at Mount Moriah Cemetery in Deadwood for Harry Tuttle. It's only been put up in the last 3 or 4 years by a historical grant. A $15,000 reward was offered by Tuttle's family. Remember I said it was a wealthy family from Pennsylvania, for information leading to his death, to his murder, but it was never collected. Now, back to these guys who killed Harry Tuttle. We know one of them was Uncle John Cashmere. We also know that these men, led by Cashmere, came into the hospital at 2 in the morning to drag Tuttle out, and that they were dressed in buffalo robes. Now, we also know that dear old Uncle John Cashmere was a renowned buffalo hunter, and his frequent companion on buffalo hunting was a guy named Bill Gay. Bill Gay had founded the town of Gayville, which is now gone, in the northern Black Hills. And he and John used to go around town wearing their buffalo robes. So I'm pretty sure that Bill Gay was involved in the murder of Harry Tuttle. Bill Gay had shot and killed a young man that he thought was paying too much attention to Bill Gay's wife. So, you know, being the Wild West, he really had no choice but to kill the young man. And he was he was tried and convicted of murder and sent off to a federal penitentiary in Detroit. And he was there a couple of months before a local uproar decided to let Bill Gay, they wanted Bill Gay to be freed. And he was. He was freed after 2 months in the federal penitentiary in Detroit. And when he arrived back in Gayville, they had a brass band waiting to greet him. He was such a popular person. Well, he stayed around Gayville for a few years and eventually moved to Montana, where he shot and killed a sheriff. And this time he didn't do so well in the courts. He was convicted of murder, sentenced to die by execution, by hanging. And they tried once, and for some reason the gallows failed. And he bragged, and he said, well, I ain't too worried. You know, they tried this once before, and I got away. Well, this time he didn't get away. And he was dragged, kicking, screaming, sobbing, and crying to the gallows for his execution. Never mind. I have an engraved invitation to his hanging in Lewiston, Montana. Bill Gay didn't survive 2 murders. Now we move to 1885 in Sturgis. There was a really bad guy named Alex Fiddler. He was roundly hated by all the Sturgis citizens, and in fact was ordered to leave town, but he never did. Now, in 1883, he and a couple of his buddies attacked a guy named Isaac Schramm, who was delivering mules to the Fort Meade Veterans Hospital near Sturgis. He had $335 with him, and Alex Fiddler pistol whipped him and took his $335. Interesting, the Sturgis paper reported that Isaac Schramm was an immigrant. Well, I guess he was. He was from Yankton, which would make him an immigrant to the Sturgis area. But anyway, Fiddler and his buddies took $335 from Alex Schramm, and they ended up getting caught. He had hidden the money behind bathroom vanity at his girlfriend's house, and she revealed it and turned him in. And he was being held in a jail in Sturgis when a mob broke in, because they were really tired of Fiddler. He hadn't murdered anybody that they knew of, but he was just a really bad guy. And they were tired of having him around. So they dragged him out of the jail in Sturgis and took him to a tree, which is no longer exists, but it's right by the Catholic cemetery at the St. Martin's Convent in Sturgis, and hanged him there. And that tree became known as Fiddler's Tree. Now, one of Fiddler's co-defendants was a guy named Hughes, who had also participated in the pistol whipping and the robbery of Isaac Schramm, the immigrant from Yankton. And Hughes's mother, Mrs. Hughes, that's all we know her by, but according to newspaper accounts, she came to Deadwood to see her son. And she somehow met up with Isaac Schramm and paid him $100 to not testify against her son. And he took the $100, but authorities found out about it, and they caught Schramm trying to ride into Wyoming. Thought he could get away with it, I guess. Dragged him back to Deadwood, and he was charged with obstruction of justice and had to do some time. But interesting story. There's always a backstory to some of these, like the probate of George Keating, and the mother of one of the criminals in the Isaac Strand case who paid off a witness to not testify. A couple of years later, as for just a soldier at the Fort Meade Hospital, or Fort Meade Army base, named Corporal Halloran, savagely beat his girlfriend, and she went to a doctor at Sturgis for treatment of her injuries. The doctor was named Horatio Lynch, unfortunate name for a story about vigilante lynchings, but Horatio Lynch told her to report the beating to the authorities, and she did so. Now her boyfriend, Corporal Halloran, became enraged at the fact that somebody would dare to turn him into authorities for beating his girlfriend up. He disguised himself. He borrowed a lower-ranking officer's uniform so they wouldn't know he was a corporal. And he went to Horatio Lynch's office and shot and killed him. He was found out, and he was dragged out of the jail at Sturgis and taken, guess where? Fiddler's Tree. The crowd kept shouting, "Take him to Fiddler's Tree." So they did. They took him to Fiddler's Tree, and they hanged him, and he is buried at the Fort Meade National Cemetery. Horatio Lynch, the doctor, the victim, is buried at Bear Butte Cemetery. Earlier, in 1881 in Custer, there was a guy, you may have heard the name, Fly Speck Billy. Fly Speck Billy, in a saloon in Custer, wanted the guy to play pool with him, and the guy declined. Said, I don't want to play pool with you, Fly Speck Billy. And Fly Speck Billy shot and killed him. And the people in the saloon then and there dragged Fly Speck Billy out of the saloon and lynched him. They didn't even have to drag him out of the jail. Fly Speck Billy met a hasty and untimely end. There was supposedly a lynching in 1877 in Belle Fourche, but I was unable to find much about it. There was a livery called the Travis Livery, and supposedly a guy named Charles Howard rented a horse and didn't bring it back within 12 hours, so the Travis family went after him and shot him. Couldn't find any real documentation of that, but I have no doubt. Now, one of the interesting things that I learned, there were no lynchings in Deadwood. Zero. Despite all the reputation you hear about Deadwood, there were none. There were a couple of legal hangings in the 19th century, and of course, Crow Dog was almost hanged, but he was reprieved by the United States Supreme Court on jurisdictional grounds. But nothing in Deadwood. A few outside of Deadwood, highwaymen had, such as a fellow named Daniel Boone May, who was employed by the railroad, tracked down a couple guys and shot them while they were trying to escape, according to his account, anyway. But nothing in Deadwood. So, all in all, Rapid City was nothing like Bannock, or rather, the Black Hills, nothing like Bannock, Montana. Didn't have the violence, the vigilantes that you saw and we heard of in Bannock during the 1850s. The civilization came to the Black Hills in the late 1870s and pretty much stayed. Outside of these hangings that I've told you about, and I think they total 9, no vigilante lynchings. So it may have been a rough and rowdy place, but for a few self-righteous people in the Spearfish and Deadwood area, nothing really that violent going on. So that concludes my story of vigilantes in the Black Hills. I appreciate your patience while I struggled with technical issues here, and I thank you all for coming. Thank you. Oh, and any questions, happy to take them. So thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'll have some goodies over to the side. I didn't get them out yet, but I will have them ready in just a few minutes. So, and also if I could have you sign your name, who all attended